Welcome to the fourth in the Thames Luminaries lecture series, a truly collaborative effort to celebrate our local history and local luminaries drawn together by the River Thames. It is my great delight to welcome you and hand you over to our wonderful chair for the Thames Luminaries series. She's a wonderful lecturer and a wonderful literary historian, and she's just wonderful all over, really. And her name's Professor Judith Hawley.
Hello. Thank you, Rachel, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for being here. We have a splendid turnout. I mean, I don't quite know why. I know William Kent's very important and John Watkins is an excellent speaker, but maybe there's a pandemic on or something. There's nothing else to do. I don't know. But the turnout for this series has been terrific. And we're delighted to be in touch with you because the historic houses and gardens across the country are really missing their audiences. And this is a very good opportunity for us to keep in touch with you and to feel that whenever we're able, we can open our doors to people who are very, very keen to come back. Practical thing, we're all sort of broadcasting from our own homes. The technology is not perfect. It's not professional broadcasting standard, though our speaker is an expert speaker. So please bear with us if there are variations in sound and image quality. But as Rachel says, there will be an opportunity to watch the talk again. If there's anything that you miss, it will go up on YouTube, on the Marble Hill House YouTube channel at the end of the series. So finally, I get to introduce our speaker tonight, John Watkins from Chiswick House and Gardens. And John has worked for English Heritage as Head of Gardens and Landscape for over 2 decades. He champions the conservation of gardens and the rejuvenation of the English Heritage Gardens portfolio. And as part of his work, he's developed the Historic and Botanic Gardens training programme, which provides opportunities for young horticulturists to gain practical experience in these sites. I'm pleased now to hand you over to John Watkins.
Well, good evening. I'm delighted to join you this evening. When I was asked to give this talk, my mind was on William Kent. So I thought, obviously, Chiswick, it would be William Kent and the birth of the English landscape movement. But of course, you can't talk about Chiswick and just Kent. It's a trio of players. And if I can introduce those players with my next slide, please. So here we see the key people who were responsible for developing the garden and early garden ideas at Chiswick in the first half of the 18th century. At its centre, we have Richard Boyle, the 3rd Earl of Burlington, and he inherited not only Chiswick House, but he also inherited Burlington House in London, just off Piccadilly, where the Royal Academy of Arts is today. He also had estates, major estates in Ireland and also in Yorkshire. So he inherited these places and was also a very wealthy man. Now, what is also fascinating, his father died when he was young, and he was brought up by his mother and his sisters, but he had a number of patrons who very much supported him in developing this young man and an interest in culture and the arts. And he became in his life a great patron of the arts, of music, architecture and gardens. And so we'll be this evening traveling through the experience of the creation of Burlington's garden at Chiswick and the involvement of key people, both in the development of the garden, but also in the development of Lord Burlington. Now, what is also interesting is that in the year of his 21st birthday, he went on the Grand Tour, and he went on the Grand Tour for a whole year. He left in May 1714 and returned exactly a year later. His birthday his 21st birthday was on the 25th of April, 1715. So that must have been a rather good party, I imagine. And that was a key moment for him going on the grand tour. He left with a grand retinue. There were 15 in the group in all. 3/4 of them were servants, but he also went with an artist and also a musician, because early on his main interests were music. His mother was very keen in music, and that was obviously a strong influence. And if you look at a lot of the places that he visited on his first grand tour, you can see that his main focus was music, but he picked up other things on the way. So the other thing to note was that while he was away, his mother started work and modernising Burlington House, and James Gibbs was employed to help with that. On Burlington's return, he got very much involved with the remodelling of Burlington House, and by 1716, Gibbs was no more, and Colin Campbell was the key architect who was assisting him. And Colin Campbell was a very important sort of tutor in helping to develop Richard Boyle's architecture. So much so that within a couple of years he was designing his first buildings, but we'll come to that shortly. A little about William Kent. We believe that Kent may have met the Earl of Burlington on his first visit to Italy, but it wasn't until Burlington's second grand tour that they finally met up and returned, and he returned with Kent, and from then Kent stayed with the family at Chiswick and was there until he died. I'll talk a bit more about Kent later, but the critical thing about Kent was his character and his abilities. He started off as an apprentice coach builder from Hull, continued to become a painter. He had then 3 sponsors who identified that this was a man with great capabilities, and they sent him to Italy in 1709. And he spent 10 years in Italy until 1719, when he returned with Burlington from his second grand tour. While he was out there, he was basically working and purchasing painting and sculpture for the various young men who were on their grand tours that they would then cart back to their great estates. And if you read about him, apparently he was great fun, and you can see that his nicknames were Kentino, or Little Signor. The third in this trio is Alexander Pope, the poet and satirist, who shared with Earl of Burlington a great interest in the ancients, both in architecture, in literature, and also gardens. He was able to promote the ideas of Lord Burlington. So the 3 together were a very powerful trio. Now, if we have the next slide, we can see where we started with at Chiswick. Here we can see the site that Burlington inherited. We've got in the centre of the picture, you can see a Jacobean house, and it's set on the Chertsey Road. Now, remember, the Chertsey Road then would have been the main road west from London. So it's really quite close to the road. Also notice that only 2 fields away is the River Thames. At this time, it may well have both been quicker and also safer to have travelled to Chiswick by river. Just to the right of Chiswick House, the old Chiswick House, which is at the centre, you can then see the stables. To the left, you can see 4 small houses. And the trees that are on the boundary just beyond those 4 houses was the boundary of Burlington's land. Just to the right of where the grand stables are, with the turning circle, that is the boundary to the left. So it's a long strip of land, and it's quite interesting to sort of note the main avenues that are here that Burlington continued on with his landscape, and so they formed the basis. It's also interesting to note at this time the areas, the fine soils at the edge of the Thames were the breadbasket for London. This is where the fruit and vegetables kept London alive were grown, and here you can see those fields and orchards that achieve that. I could have the next slide, please. This next slide is a sort of better graphical illustration, and here you see this sort of narrow slot of land with the Jacobean house, with the stable yard, and gardens really very simple, with grass plats to the left of the house and a small knot garden to the rear. And then there were northern walled garden enclosures behind that. If I could have the next slide, please. So what were Burlington's first operations in the garden? Well, he had that main avenue that was existent. So starting with that main avenue, and you can see this here, he built his first building, which was the domed building. And at this time, his mother was using James Gibbs at their main London house, and so he got James Gibbs to produce this domed building as a focal point at the end of this main avenue. This was then developed by creating 2 further avenues, one to the east, one to the west. And the next one was the bagno, the bathhouse, which was later to become Burlington's drawing house. This was built in 1717, designed by Burlington. And so this is a very rapid development to be able to produce a building of such accomplishment so quickly, which suggests that it's likely that he'd been studying architecture and practicing his drawing, and while he was on the grand tour will have been drawing and sketching and recording the detail that he saw. We then see the third toe on the right-hand side is the rustic house, again thought to be designed by Burlington in 1719, with a much more rusticated approach at the base of this long avenue. And all these are shown in the rock engraving, which was published in 1736, quite some time later, but we can still see these various elements. So it's useful for me to use this to show you. If I could have the next slide, please. The next structures that were to be built was the Doric column, the rustic arch, and the deer house. So on the left-hand side, set within hedging, we have the Doric column with the Medici statue on the top. We then have, moving right, we then have a ha-ha with a deer house on the left-hand side corner, and then a rustic arch at the other end of the ha-ha. So this triangular space was initially the space where Lord Burlington kept his deer, which were very much a status symbol for a young earl. The layout you can see here is what was there in 1736. The images I've got below show the Doric column, show the deer house where they would have been kept the food for the deer. What you see on the right-hand side is a much later structure that replaced the rustic arch. This went in place in 1739 and was a gift to Burlington from Hans Sloane. And this is important for Burlington, and a really treasured gift, because it's an Inigo Jones gateway that had been designed by Inigo Jones in 1621 for Beaufort House in Chelsea, and it was moved here after that house was pulled down. I'll talk a little bit more about this area later because there were later phases of this. If I could have the next slide, please. Here we can see, looking through the grove, you can just make out on the right-hand side the deer house. You can make out a later orangery that was put in place once the deer had moved. This would have been in the 1730s, and there you can see the Inigo Jones gateway on the right-hand side. So this was later to become another orange garden. Could I have the next slide, please? In 1721, Burlington married Lady Dorothy Saville, and probably one of the reasons he married her, was because their shared interest in music. I should note that when Burlington returned from his grand tour, another house guest was Handel, so I'm sure the music in the household was excellent. Work started on the new house in the new villa in 1725. So this image is quite useful because it shows on the right-hand side, there you can see the stables and support buildings for the estate. You've then got the old Jacobean house that was still used, still lived in, and then you've got the villa. And they created a link building that linked the two, and effectively that link building became a hall on two levels that linked both buildings. And if you go to Chiswick, it's worth going to the link building and sort of walking through the house, imagining that as the hall. It's very much sort of a mini pillared hall. What is quite clear here is also the layout in front of the house, with new gate piers, with the Sphinx at the top of each pier. A later addition to this were also the cedars, which are likely to come later when they purchased the next door estate with their cedars, and they helped to set the house off on the left and right. But you can see the very busy Chertsey Road, or Chertsey Lane as it would have been called. If I can have the next slide, please. We'll then, there was then a succession of further buildings. We have the Temple by the Water, and you can see the Temple by the Water is on the left-hand side, and the early stages, it would have been just next to the Bollow Brook, which was effectively at that time a sort of narrow ditch, and the other side of that, south of here, would have been land owned by his neighbour. But here you've got the Temple by the Water. It may have been used, temple, as an early orangery. That was built in 1727. If we go to the next slide, there we've got the Ionic Temple and orange tree garden. And it's likely that would have been developed over a number of phases. The building at the back of the Ionic Temple, to the rear, Ionic temple was built after they purchased the land on the other side of the water, so that there was a good vista from that side. And if I could have the next image, please. And here we have a formal basin and bosquets. And it's quite interesting to think how these were constructed. They were effectively constructed, the pools were dug out next to the Bollow Brook, and the water and the soil that was dug out was then piled up at either end, and they then planted that with the bosquets that you can see there, bosquets being little woods. If I could have the next slide, please. And so this is quite useful. This is showing Rock's survey published in 1736. This is quite critical because it's showing a number of things coming together here. It shows a major change from about 1726 to 1727 is where Burlington purchased Judd's Close, Gubbins, and also Sutton Court to the south. That gave him great opportunity to further develop the landscape. It's also interesting to note that on the 12th of June 1729, Richard Morgan was making 68 tubs for both Chiswick and Sutton Court. It's likely that these tubs would have been for the orange trees that were later placed behind the Ionic temple. The key element in taking on the next estate was doing more with water, and this is the next really important stage of canalizing the Bollow Brook, creating a bigger stretch of water. And so here you can see that large stretch of water, starting to introduce bridges across onto the new landscape. And I'll a couple of things to point out. Notice just to the rear of the house how dense the trees are. Still very, very dense there, and it must have seemed very strange just so close to the house. You can see that the new villa is in place, and by this time, by 1736, Kent has started his work in creating a view from the new villa through to what would be the exedra. But notice that all that has been put in place are as yew hedging. There is yet no statues in that place. And they were also working out different ways of getting both carts and carriageways across the brook, because beyond the new river, as they were now calling it, that then went underneath the Chertsey Road and in a ditch that the other side through into the Thames. So it was an important waterway. If I can now have the next slide, please. So here you can see the view of the exciting new garden on the other side of the new water. Very, very new hedges, very, very new trees. You can just see the view of Burlington's a bathing house, which is in fact his drawing house, and you can see the little white bridge over there. So it's fascinating in seeing this new established landscape. What's also interesting to see what changes hadn't happened. From here, you've got no view of the villa or the house. It's completely blocked out. If we could now move on to the next slide. This is the view from the terraced. So you may wonder what happened to all the soil and subsoil from making the new water. Well, this was piled up along the road boundary in order to create a terrace. This was a terrace from which you could view the garden, but you could also view outside Burlington's lands, and no doubt interesting views looking across farmland towards the River Thames, and the boats flying their way back and down. If I could have the next slide. Oh, actually, before we go, sorry, if you could take me back again to the previous slide. Interesting to note here, notice the villa, notice the very formal approach, rectangle of grass with yew hedging either side, and on the right hand side of that a formal sort of topiary garden. So very, very formal approach between the house and the new river. If I could have the next slide now. So this is starting to show this in a more graphic state. We've here we can see this, the estate in 1753. 1753 is the date that Burlington died, and so this shows all the elements that were carried out. Things to point out to you. If we travel across the bridge near the Bagno, which they call the Casina on this. Here's the Casina, the Bagno. Notice there is a bridge crossing here, and you'll find that there would have then been a walk where you'd have been able to walk around the extension of the garden and looking over the new parkland, where he could admire his deer in a much more grand parkland that you can see. I can see round here. If I can point out the Burlington Lane gate with the obelisk, and we'll see that shortly. Here we've got the terrace where you can view down towards the Thames here and out over the garden. Also, you can see later on that the trees have been very much thinned out over here. And we've got the creation of the exedera over here. So you and you've also got developments of the walk here, which I will talk to you about a little bit later. And if I could have the next slide, because I think we now really start to look at the work of Kent. What is fascinating is how Kent worked. So Kent started off as a painter. He then became an interior designer. He then became an architect. He then became a garden designer. And he accomplished all of these things by being able to produce these wonderful characteristic images that showed not only how things should look and be designed, but how they would fit into their settings. And so these were hugely influential in creating the character of the space. So whereas Burlington was excellent at designing his buildings and creating little scenes around each of these sort of buildings, what Kent accomplished was creating this landscape that brought all these things together, and in a way truly creating a landscape of the ancients, which was the aim of Burlington and the interest of all three of them. So on the very sort of domestic side, here we can see a small garden that was very close to the old house. It was Lady Burlington's flower garden. Here you can see a pool, there was a vollery, a bird cage, and also flowers, and you can see most likely oranges in pots. And we can see here James Cambridge, her servant, with a wheelbarrow. Perhaps he's assisting her in the garden. So this is a Kentian design. And if we look at the lower one, here we see a romantic image of the Burlington Gate with the obelisk, with Kent lying at the base of it, a moonlit night, and you can see dancing rabbits and a dog. You always see dogs in Kent's sketches. what is interesting is the Arundel marbles were placed at the base of the obelisk, and they had been a gift to Burlington in his youth. These next designs show a progression of Kentian sketches. We have one for the Cascade, and on the top, and the second we have a sketch of the Exedra. What's interesting to note about the Exedra is Kent's sketches for the Exedra here. His early ones were later used to produce the Temple of Worthies at Stowe, and we see a much sort of simpler layout here. We've got three statues. We've got Caesar, Pompey, and Sisera. These three came from Hadrian's villa, so they were important sculptures. We then have, so those three are the politicians. We then have the philosophers in Socrates, Ligurus, and Lucius Verus. And then we have busts of Homer and Virgil. And in between these sculptural elements, you will see 12 stone seats, and those were meant to be senatorial seats. There was a story that these had originally come from Italy, but they're all made of Portland stone and therefore were English made. But this composition is the sort of thing that you would have expected to perhaps see in Pliny's own garden. If I can have the next image, please. These last sketches I'm showing were all produced by John Donowell and are really useful. These were undertaken in 1753 and show what was there at the end of Burlington's life, and show sort of the climax also of Kent's work. The interesting thing to point out here, I find of most interest, is you'll see the avenue coming off from the villa, and with monumental statues. You've also got both cedars, and these would have come from the next door estate where they had a large collection of them, and you've also got cupressus, and these monumental statues. And the idea of this was that is meant to represent the Apennine Way out of Rome, this road where there were monuments to great battles and great heroes. And so this is a little bit of Rome in Chiswick. We then look on the image on the right that shows sort of the progression and sort of the finessing of these avenues. We can see the trees have grown up, and there's a much sort of tighter finish. Probably Kent might not have approved of that. If I could have the next slide, please. The one on the top, there you can see the villa. You can see Kent's finished work on the Cascade, a little bridge and the road in front of that, linking it all together. And you very much see the this is a landscape that Kent would have been proud of. But the important thing, big difference, do you see that formality has gone? And that is all important. I will show you a modern picture of that shortly. And the bottom image shows us the view from the Bagnio looking the other way, and you can see what's likely to have been a white wooden bridge crossing the New River. If we could go to the next image, please. And here we have the modern view, and here, in a way, it's quite a simple lawn looking at a piece of water, but this was revolutionary in the 18th century, and this is highly influential. It influenced landscapes across the UK, across Europe, and no doubt influenced the design of Central Park in New York. these are ideas of informality, informal water, informal grass, informal planting, but also with formal elements of interest. And it was Horace Walpole that describes of Kent that he leapt the fence and saw that all nature was a garden. And this is where he carried it out at Chiswick first. So we finish off with the death of Burlington in 1753, and his friends died before him. William Kent in 1748 and Pope in 1744. Not much work was carried out at Chiswick beyond the late 1730s, early 40s. Kent was short of money and he'd fallen out with court, and so he very much based himself at home and on his estates then, didn't carry out much architecture at all after that time. So we're fortunate in seeing a very special landscape at Chiswick. It was then inherited by the 4th Duke of Devonshire, via Kent's daughter. Nothing much was done at Chiswick until his son, the 5th Duke of Devonshire, employed lappage in the latent part of the 18th century to deformalize the landscape further. There starts a new story. But if I could have my final slide that shows that landscapes do continue and how important people are, I would just like to sort of commemorate Fiona Crumley, who was the head gardener at Chiswick during the restoration 12 years ago, and very sadly died a couple of weeks ago, which is very sad for all of us who knew her well. She was so important to Chiswick and brought community together with the love of the site and continued support for the rest of her life. All those who wanted to make the most of the landscape at Chiswick, and also was involved with gardener training and supporting gardens and gardeners across London. So thank you, Fiona, for all that you did at Chiswick and for horticulture generally. So thank you very much, everybody. I'll be very happy to answer any of your questions for the rest of the evening.